I'm going to welcome back our guests who we just heard speak in the moment, in Vivian and Nikki. But before I do that, I want to introduce to us two other leaders who are bringing phenomenal reputation, not only for their passion for this topic, but their leadership of it in a corporate context, who are going to join in our panel conversation. First up, we've got Arlene Strom, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary for Suncor. She's also the chair of the Suncor Energy Foundation and the chair of their Inclusion and Diversity Council. Joining Arlene is Vern Yu, who's the Executive Vice President of Corporate Development and the Chief Financial Officer at Enbridge. He's also on the board of the Calgary Economic Development and is the chair of the Enbridge Tour Alberta for Cancer. Can you join me in welcoming Arlene and Vern and re-welcoming back Nikki and Dr. Vivian Ming? Thank you. Come on out. Welcome, welcome. Pick whichever colour you like. Great. It is, it's very colourful. Oh, all right, I'm excited for this conversation. I'm excited for what our audience are going to ask us to delve into as well. But I thought I might kick off, Arlene and Vern, with both of you. We've titled this session basically smashing the energy echo chamber. And Arlene, I thought maybe I'd come to you first. When you think about that provocative topic, what's the echo chamber that we need to smash, in your opinion?
Wow, it's such a wonderful place to start, especially after listening to a bit of my colleagues on this panel talk. When I think about the echo chamber, I think for too long we have been looking for solutions for some of our big challenges that we have within, you talk about singing to the choir, within our choir.
Yep.
And so when I think about smashing the echo chamber, I think about collaboration. And, we don't have all the answers to any of these challenges that we're facing. And we really need to collaborate. And it's hard work. So my personal passion, Holly, is I am deeply committed to being on this journey of reconciliation. And I'm already grateful to Nikki for helping me to be able to talk about what decolonization means. I love this concept of collective healing. And I still have so much to learn. But having been on this journey with people who are Indigenous friends, leaders, employees who are deeply generous of spirit and helping me learn along this journey, I think this is so important to dealing with the challenges in the energy space.
Totally, and I want to come back to humble leadership a little bit later on in terms of the lessons, this work on self that Nikki talked about that we need to do before we can do any kind of collective work. Vern, I want to come to you first though. What's your thought around the idea of smashing the energy echo chamber?
For me, it's about how everyone in the world uses energy. And for a very long time, the people who made the decisions about energy were very much a homogeneic group of people who didn't really get to see the broader world. We all need energy to live. We need energy for food. We need energy to move. It is a big part of our life. But if it's just a bunch of people sitting around a table in Calgary or Houston, Texas, or Moscow, or Riyadh, we're not going to make the right decisions on how and what energy should look like over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So it's important to have the full society weigh in on what kind of energy do we develop, how do we use it, how do we make it affordable, how do we make it sustainable.
I'm mindful, Nikki and Vivian, you had an opportunity to give some kick-off remarks, but I know, Vivian, at least you said, I want to come to the energy conversation in a moment. Do you want to add into that when you think about the energy echo chamber?
I mean, obviously, I spent some time up here talking without using the term echo chamber, this aspect by which we tend to herd around safe ideas. And it's difficult to break out of that. But there are ways of doing it. I mentioned one, just rethinking how we incentivize people to think about new ideas and seek them out. But I think the underlying story I was trying to get at is an interesting finding about collective intelligence is the individual intelligence of the members of a team are not particularly predictive. It's actually our ability, perspective taking and social skills tend to be more predictive of the collective intelligence of a team, of a community. And it's because, therefore, our ability to actually hear another person. And then the other very consistent predictor, which I already mentioned, was that those teams are themselves diverse. They're made up of different people with different backgrounds, socioeconomic, cultural backgrounds, but race and gender are always prominent players in this space. So there are things we know generically outside of the energy domain really help us to think more broadly, to explore the questions. So the point being, you know, I have a favorite paper that came out actually in 2020. It has the title, The Innovation Diversity Paradox. And the finding, which I will attempt to summarize extremely quickly here, is the more of an outlier a person was within their field of research, theoretical physics, philosophy, it didn't matter, the more innovative their dissertations. This AI that got built by some friends of mine at Stanford read every single dissertation published since 1973,
Wow.
1.8 million papers, to make this discovery. The people that were outliers in their fields, shock of all shocks, had more innovative ideas. I suspect that AI was probably the only thing that ever in the entire universe read my dissertation. I sure as hell did not. But the parallel, the paradox, is those same people went unsighted, unrecognized. They didn't, they're much less likely at every level to get promoted up from grad student to postdoc to junior faculty and so on. Their ideas were being produced, but they were not being heard by the discipline. And we see that same thing play out again and again. So I mean, I'm right with everyone here on the idea that we need to break out of this echo chamber and hear more voices, because the numbers tell us that, well outside the particular problem we're talking about today. And really, it becomes a very human question. How do we go beyond this? I don't think it helps anyone to say you're the villain because you look a certain way or you didn't make a certain choice, as opposed to at least affording people something tangible to change their behavior and to hear more broadly.
Nikki, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think often about the invisible architecture that allows for infrastructures of power to maintain themselves. You know, and you can think about this within high levels of academia, the law, the government. Now, you know, echo chambers is something that most of us are familiar with in terms of our vocabulary, because we navigate virtual spaces within which the invisible architecture that determines what algorithms bring us where. Often are experiences that we're really familiar with, but we're not necessarily clear about the infrastructure that actually creates those experiences. And you know, thinking about what Vern said, energy is something that's very intimately well known for all of us, for all human beings on Earth. I don't think a lot of us are very clear or have accessible understandings of who dictates how that flows. And so for me, a lot about kind of democratizing that is actually allowing for understanding and more clarity around those invisible structures, those invisible powers that historically have been kept that way to ensure that power is held by a few and isn't able to be democratized in ways that I think for a sustainable future it really needs to be.
I want to tease out a couple of those threads. So we talked on the human problem there, we talked a bit about architecture and structure. So let's take the human part of the equation first. And let's make it personal in the sense, I know some of you do actually have diversity and inclusion in your job title, but there is this sense sometimes when you hear that word, geez, this is a big idea, gee, that's above my pay grade, that's someone else's job, someone else's responsibility. What's the work we need to do on ourselves in order to create permission, role model? Arlene, I'd love, you started delving into this. I'm still learning. I've been on a humble leadership journey. Humility is critical. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? What is it we need to do ourselves?
Well, I think that's the starting point, is being willing to sit in these spaces and listen and learn and be uncomfortable. I mean, we've all touched on this theme of discomfort, because it is not comfortable. I was just last week. We have an Indigenous Youth Advisory Council that is made up of Indigenous youth from across the country who are from areas where we have operations. And I had the great privilege to spend time together with these young people. And we started in ceremony. So we started in ceremony by committing that the relationship that we were entering into, and we started this council a number of years ago, but by recommitting that this is a sacred and respectful relationship where, doesn't mean we won't disagree,
Sure.
but that we will come back into ceremony. I'm a co-pipe carrier with one of the young people. And we set this stage to share and to talk about difficult things. And you really do have to set aside, you know, where I start from some of the times. And it's such, like the bravery and the challenge that comes from these young people is remarkable. One of the young women said, you know, she said, we talk about safe spaces. I don't know if there's such a thing as a safe space. It's not necessarily safe, but you need it to be a brave space. And so back to your question, what do we need to do for ourselves? I mean, I feel like I need to be part of being willing to step into this space, to listen to brave people who are willing to challenge, who are willing to help me learn, who are willing to push around. And the collaboration doesn't end with a ceremony. Or it doesn't even end with a successful collaboration. That's the other part. It continues over time. And I think it's so important that we realize this is a long-term commitment.
Absolutely. Who else would like to add in? I was watching a few nods there. Anyone else want to add into what we can do on the human standpoint, the work we can do on ourselves?
You mentioned the idea of a safe space. So a common concept that comes a lot in business discussions nowadays and psychological research that ties directly to that is the idea of psychological safety, which could be misinterpreted as being some woke ideal of being easy on people. For me, it's a very specific thing. Do your individual employees feel that they could pitch an idea that they themselves think might not work, but boy, if it did, it would transform everything? If they pitched an idea and it failed, would it be held against them? If they thought that's the reality, then you don't have a psychologically safe space. And if you think that, again, people just need to be tougher, let me tell you, as someone who's gone through gender transition, fucking mansplaining is the most aggregating thing in the entire world. I signed up for all the rest of this, but that, to this day, drives me up the wall. Having someone else explain my own research to me, wow, I love it. But, so, you know, clearly, that doesn't feel like a very psychologically safe space. And you may also get the feeling, I'm pretty empowered. I don't mind telling people when I think they're wrong. But even then, you're getting the message, I don't actually want to hear what you have to say. And so, you know, one of the things I often do with companies that ask me to come in, I'm not a consultant, but I run a philanthropy, and I like to think that this would make the world better, is I not only tell the young people to be more courageous, as though like there's a switch and they just didn't realize it's been on cowardly, and courageous, that's right, that's what I should have been doing. But I actually have an exercise where for the next week, I tell all those junior employees, go tell your SVP of whatever what they're doing that's wrong. Go tell them F you. And the senior leadership have to take it. They have to listen. No retaliation. They have to hear what these people are saying. By the way, I 100% believe 99% of what they're going to be told is probably not right. I'm a big believer in having experience and expertise. But you've got to hear it, because that 1% idea could be transformative. And so this comes back to me again and again, is I'm sure many people feel like discussions like this are just about people that want a piece of the pie too, and they feel they're being excluded or they're not being tough enough. And it isn't. It is about what makes us as a community as intelligent and as nimble as possible. And it requires these kinds of conversations and the opening up the dimensions of discussion. So, I mean, that's what I'm hearing when I'm hearing the need for having these conversations.
Yeah. Nikki?
Yeah, I'd love to build on what Dr. Ming just said. I recently learned through polyvagal theory that reciprocity is a neuroexpectant. So our nervous system, if we are not in relational accountability and reciprocity, our nervous system feels that as a lack of safety. And our brains, when we don't feel safe, don't operate to the capacity that they can. And so when we're thinking about meaningful leadership, right, what do we have to do to embody reciprocity so that we can get the best from our teams? And for me, this is where the work of decolonization comes in again, is reciprocity. We were discussing this backstage. Reciprocity is a value, a kind of core paradigm of Indigenous people around the world. And here we have, beautiful research, beautiful neuroscience coming and affirming these traditional knowledges that we've held for millennia.
Vern, anything to add?
Well, this is a great conversation because when I take it back to being somebody responsible for a large organization, it's about creating an atmosphere where there's the diversity of thought to make the best business decision, whether it's for your stakeholders, whether it's for your shareholders, whether it's for your employees. And oftentimes, as somebody with privilege of having wealth, having power, you don't often put yourselves in the shoes of other people. So we as an organization have to create the ability to have those conversations where people are not afraid to talk about what they believe in, that stakeholders can tell us truthfully without feeling influenced by us about what they care about and what is meaningful to them. At the end of the day, our shareholders should like that because that makes us a better and more successful business. So it's not one or the other, it's how do we make all these things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk now a little bit about the structural, if we can. So what are some things that we need to shift in kind of the way that we do things? And Vivian, I might get you to bridge us there if you can, though, because there's a piece for me around the storytelling that bridges the human and the structural. And I'm interested if you could share your diversity tax and the origin of why that was something that you thought to originate even as a paradigm shifter.
Yeah. So along the way, I started my professional career as a scientist at UC Berkeley, a theoretical neuroscientist, which is a very hoity-toity thing. Really, we're just incredibly lazy people that can't be bothered to run real experiments, so we just do them on computers. And then after that, I started a few companies. And one of them, I was the chief scientist of one of the first companies doing AI in hiring. And I've never had to interview for a job in my whole life. What the hell do I know about what makes great hiring? So I started reading as much research as I could. It's a problem that's been literally studied for 100 years. And I read up all this stuff, and we got a lot of press for our system that we built. And I started getting calls from economists and from the press themselves, and this one very interesting call came in. It was USA News and World Report, which meant it was actually a meaningful story a month beforehand, and they were just getting to it.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was unneeded hostility, but they said there's this guy named Jose Zamora, and he's written a blog post about how he's sending out 100 resumes a day and not getting any responses. So he drops the S out of his name. Now it's Joe Zamora, and suddenly he claims he's getting all these responses that Jose wasn't. Same guy, same resume, one letter change in the name. Dr. Ming, does this sound plausible to you? And I'm like, Jesus, your own paper, I can now say in retrospect, has published research on this very question multiple times. But whatever, we all have the memories of mayflies. So I decided to do something a little different. I had a database of 122 million people, working professionals. Instead of running an experiment, let's see what's actually going on in my data set. So I pulled out every single Joe and every single Jose. You're not Joseph on LinkedIn. You wrote Joe. That is you. And what we found was fascinating differences between Joes and Joses, and particularly in the software engineering industry. But because of the AI built, we could actually control for differences in these individuals. So I asked myself a very specific question, given our capability. What does Jose need to get the same probability of promotion for the same quality of work as Joe with, and what we found was Jose needed, for example, in the software engineering industry, a master's degree or higher to get the same probability as Joe with no degree whatsoever.
Yes.
So now we've got this data that we have, this massive data, where we could look at men versus women, we could look at gay versus straight, and see what is the extra work that someone has to do to achieve the same outcomes, even though they're equally qualified. And I was asked once to chat with Jeb Bush about it back when people thought he'd be relevant to the world. And I thought, how do I talk about economic inclusion with a well-intentioned conservative? And I thought, let's call it exactly what it is. It's a tax. It's the tax on being different. And we could actually measure it to a dollar amount. So for Jose versus Joe, we found it was about $750,000 worth of extra effort to achieve the same outcomes. We see this a lot with young women having to do extra thing, go get the MBA. I get asked this a lot. I'm a young woman. I feel like I need to accelerate my career. I need to get an MBA. And I say, yeah, you might need to, but understand it's not being expected of your peers. This is just what you need to do to pay the tax. And this influences then. It's a tax also on innovation and new ideas. It's a tax on the people that are different. And I already told you, they are more likely to come up with novel, impactful ideas. So you tax the thing you do not want. You don't want innovation? Tax difference. You don't want to bring a full diversity of employees and hire from the entire globe instead of just Stanford and McGill? Tax difference. And you'll get yourself exactly that. So I like, in the end, to bring it back to these terms, not because people's lives are dollars and cents, but because it is a common conversation we can have across political division.
So Arlene, I want to come to you. When we think about structurally the corporate context, how have you approached that as a leader in charge of the Diversity Inclusion Council at a major organisation? What structurally have you had to shift and be really intentional about leaning into conversations and fundamentally, whether it's programmatic, salary, leadership, hiring, decisions, you've had to really go about changing the way that we work?
Yeah, there's a number of examples that I could talk about as we think about the journey in this inclusion space. And we've looked at the different priority areas, and one of them was specifically structural. What structural biases are in place that are holding people back or holding back opportunities for some of our employees? And so one of the areas that we looked at was parental leave, for example. And we found that there was a whole bunch of things that were structurally built into that system that were not giving, in this case it was particularly women, the same opportunities when they came back from parental leave. So they would go away, and we, in a very we'll look after you kind of way, said, hand in your computer, hand in your phone, we don't want you to be bothered while you're off on parental leave. And so now they're cut off. They have no email access, they are not talking to their peers, they're not thinking about or talking to people about what the job is that they're going to come back to. And so they'd often come back and they would be unhappy, and we found that we were losing a lot of really great women who would come back from parental leave. So we had to change a bunch of those structural things. We also had to change our policy around how we paid people when they went on parental leave, so that we were giving adoptive parents the same kinds of benefits as we were giving birth parents. And so those were some structural things that we had to do in that space. But there's lots in the hiring space and in how we support employees to learn from one another and to get support from one another and to gather together. So there's a number of different ways that we continue to work on in the structural space.
Similar for you, Vern?
Yeah, I think large organizations have unconscious bias. And one of the big struggles you have as an organization is to try to eliminate that. But I think we did a lot of work around programs like Arlene talked about. But at the end of the day, if you want to look like society, you have to set a goal and measure if you're actually making progress against looking at like society. We operate in 41 states. We operate in 9 provinces. We operate in 3 countries in Europe. And if we don't tell our employee base and our leaders that we want at least 40% of our workforce to be women, at least 28% of our workforce to represent underrepresented groups and ethnicity, it will not happen. There's organizational inertia, and these biases will continue, and you'll make excuses, and you'll put in programs. So we found as an organization it's been critical to set these goals, to measure them, make sure we're making concrete progress, and if we're not, to have a hard look on why the needle's not moving. So I know people don't like the idea of quotas, but it does actually make a difference.
Nikki, I welcome your thoughts on any of this, but I do want to lean into the top voted question, which says, this event seems white-dominated, steeped in wealth and market capitalist thinking. How could energy disruptors meaningfully disrupt those dynamics in future? Which is very much, as much as I can sit here and say we're so proud of the diversity commitment that we've had since day one, I would say still we're the only energy event that have always been mindful of equal gender split from year one of our summit. Very intentional this year, 25 different countries worth of speakers flown in to be a part of the conversation. We know we can do better. We were having a conversation already backstage about what can we do better to progress this. So I'd love, Nikki, you can kick us off, but any of the panel, what could we do to shake it up next year and meaningfully do a better job at this?
Yeah, I just want to say, people asking questions exactly like this and you not being afraid to echo them and bring them forward to a panel like this is exactly how we begin to do better. We name the reality, right? That is the reality.
It is.
And
yeah.
the fact that you're willing to say that and not silence it and make space to have critical conversations. But I want to tie this back into the conversation that we were previously having, which is a lot has shifted in terms of HR recruiting, having these objectives that are so necessary. But the structural realities of the institutions that we're welcoming these quote unquote diverse people into haven't. And so you can invite people into a space that wasn't created for them, and then when they don't succeed the way that you want them to, say that it's not working. Often, my elder always talks about it as like inviting people over for dinner and having nowhere for them to sit. You cannot ask Indigenous people, Black people, people of color, trans people, people who don't have ableism in the same way that you're planning for, to come in and succeed if you haven't prepared for their arrival in a meaningful way. And I think that's true. That's true within a business. It's true with an event like this. It's not just about getting people through the door. When they get through the door, was this environment created with them in mind? Are they going to see them? Are they going to feel comfortable? Are they going to have places to meaningfully participate and be heard? Are we going to be in a place where we see enough reciprocity that our nervous systems feel safe so we can access our prefrontal cortex and have meaningful conversations with people maybe who we don't feel like we have common ground with, but then we're able to find it. And so I think that's really, we are now at a place where some really great work has been done by people like Dr. Ming so that we can actually see these taxes are real, but what are we going to do about them? And that requires our leadership and the people who don't often want to relinquish power to be willing to show up and commit to structural changes.
No, I love that point, and it's interesting you say that because Michelle and I were talking backstage after our conversation, Nikki, about how important it is next year that we think about the advisory group and the different perspectives we can bring onto that in terms of working right the way through the planning and content design and who can speak in. So exactly that, you don't have people arriving and not seeing themselves reflected in the event design, in the programming, you name it. Arlene, you look like you wanted to add in. Jump on.
No, I was just going to say, I love the metaphor of creating a little bit of heat for change.
Yeah.
It's like, you're making a stew, and if you have just a bunch of water and rice and vegetables, it's a bit of a mess. But you create some heat, you end up with something really good. And if you have too much heat, it boils over. And so I think the heat of creating opportunities for conversations. Like, for example, last year on September 30th, on Truth and Reconciliation Day, we had a circle where one of the employees who led that circle with executives and some of our employees from operating areas was expressing how he has come from a situation where he's been with the company for almost 30 years. A big part of him wasn't even able to express that he was Indigenous or to talk about it or to step into that leadership space. And so it's not perfect. I'm not trying to claim, checkbox, we're done. I'm just saying that if we can change the conversation and allow people like that to lead and to be to be at the table, I think we can make really positive,
and I want to invite all of you to be a part of that process too. If you've got suggestions for how we can improve, please find Graham, Michelle, myself, shoot us an email, write to us on a message on social to the Energy Disruptors account in the DMs, whatever you want to do. We would love to take that feedback on, and we would love to work with you all in how we improve year on year. We're always challenging ourselves to be better, and we want to absolutely be practicing what we preach. But I love your point there that this is a journey, not a destination. We will come back in 5 years and we will have moved the dial forward and we will still have so much work to go back and do. And we embrace that. Vivian, I want to come to you and welcome any of your thoughts on that, but there's also a question for you at the top. So you can start with your add-on there, and then I want to throw to you, how would Dr. Ming suggest large organizations, hierarchical organizations, break the gap of herding towards the safe and maximize exploration?
Yes, so let's wrap it up. Somehow magically I'm going to bring together how we diversify the event and the companies, and then I'll end there, because there have been a couple of questions that have popped up along here about, so Vern and Vivian say we should hire diverse teams. Doesn't that mean we hire less qualified people? And no, we never said that. If you're hiring people that are making your organization worse, you're doing a shitty hiring job. I don't want to pretend that doesn't come with a cost, though.
Yeah.
Right? It might. In fact, usually that cost is time. Are you willing to commit the time to finding someone that makes your team better? And let me emphasize, I'm very much a believer in hiring for teams. I already cited the research, which is multiply replicated, that raw intelligence is not much of a predictor in collective intelligence. It's good having some people. You want diversity, including that. But in fact, when I hire people, I have one single question for my academic lab, for my companies. Pitch me a mad science project. So come up with the wildest thing you can think of that you truly believe would make the world a better place. And then for an hour, I work with them. I don't punch holes in it. This isn't a dissertation defense. I work with them to figure out how to make it work. And if I think we came up with a better idea together than I could have come up with by myself, then they got the job. I can teach them programming, I can teach them math, I can teach them brains. I cannot teach someone to have an idea I would never have had. That is fundamentally beyond me. How do we build the best teams? And I will be honest, the cost is almost always time. If you invest the time, you can find people to make a panel. You know how many times I've been the only woman on an AI panel, and I fully recognize that's an awkward thing for someone that didn't start their life that way. You invest the time. There's amazing women in AI. There's amazing diverse voices in energy. How do we make certain we've sought them out? I was going to cite this during my talk, but you were there. You already know that I'm incompetent. We ran this experiment in which people had to collaborate with others to maximize. They got actual dollars out of the experiment. So they were incentivized to collaborate. And in fact, the design of it was they had to collaborate across differences. So they had to go find people that were maximally different from themselves. We'd ask them before the experiment started, do you understand? And they would explain. Virtually every single participant understood. They would maximize their returns if they found a diverse group of people and collaborated with them in the experiment. And then you start the experiment, and almost immediately everybody clusters up into little homogeneous clusters. And by accent, by skin color, all sorts of things. Almost like that. They were intellectually able to describe their better selves, and then, bam, they went and did this other thing and got less dollars as a result. It was good for my pocketbook, terrible for humanity. So we have to break out of that. And one of the obvious things is actively, I talked about exploring. I was talking about exploring ideas. Explore people. Actively go out and find the people that should be on a panel, the voice that hasn't gotten heard, even if you don't agree with it. I mean, what an amazing opportunity Holly has to potentially bring people up and disagree with them, but do it in a way which is productive. So this idea that hiring for difference means setting lower standards is, I know it's out there, it's in many people's beliefs. It is 100% not true.
I love that.
But there's a cost associated with it. So I've yammered on for too long, but just to really quickly, when we looked at all these different companies and where did we see the smartest teams, it was companies that made space, not all the time. They could be very hierarchical in one way, but in moments they allowed small teams to break off, go have conversations, ideate on their own, and then come back into the whole, and then break off and come back in the whole. And people often talk about corporations having like an immune system against innovation. And it's true, we could see that. But in the smartest companies, the ones that had the most smart teams, it was a norm. It was a flow, a process by which people come and go. And interestingly, we saw it then on the teams. The individual members would break apart and spend time ideating on their own, and then come back together and collaborate, and then break apart. And then we saw teams come together and break apart, and then at this structure of the whole organization. So the idea that your org chart is your company, and it has to follow that pattern, is a problem. It's flawed.
Yep.
What's really going on is much more dynamic, much more of a living thing, and an ecosystem. And I think companies that get comfortable with that and build a norms around that breadth, that allostasis of innovation, they're the ones that succeed. If anyone wants to get into the technical details, I'll be around for a little bit, and I'm happy to chat about it. But that's the difference we see in the companies that are successful despite hierarchy, and those that are trapped and crystallized in their hierarchy.
Vern, I want to come to you. Anything else you'd add there?
Well, I think it's about, I want to put this very simply, this concept of a tax, that you have to pay more to be equal, is something that my parents taught me growing up as a minority, was you have to be better to be equal and to get a seat at the table. And somehow we as an organization and we as a society have to get over that, where you just have to be equal to be equal. And unfortunately, I'm teaching my children the exact same thing that my parents have taught me, is even though Canada has progressed a long ways in the 50s odd years that I've been alive, you still, because you look different, need to be better to be equal. And that's sad, but it unfortunately is the reality, and we have to keep pushing, or we're not going to make the progress we need to make.
Absolutely. Now, our conversation is drawing towards a close, so I want to wrap us up, but we've got a question I want to say. It's a tricky one to ask a panelist on the spot. We're going to see if we can go there. The top voted question is, what are some unsafe or non-echo chamber ideas or examples you could point to that would move us to a just and equitable transition and achieve climate goals? So we've spoken broadly around things that we believe could move the dial positively for diversity and inclusion, but now linking it to equitable transition and climate goals. We don't have long remaining, so short stab at that question each. Vivian, I might start with you and work our way down.
Short stab. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to say something that is. I was once at a conference that asked a very similar question, so I pitched out my crazy idea, an AI-driven super PAC whose whole purpose is to put any member of the US Congress that has ever used the word science as a dirty word out of office. So that's not battery technology, it's not hydrogen, but that's something I know how to build, and that would genuinely change the conversation.
I love it. All right, that's an unsafe idea. Let's go there. Nikki.
Yeah, I'm going to make another case for decolonization. When we really break down the paradigms of value within colonization, it's patriarchy, it's ableism, it's heteronormativity, it's white supremacy. The majority of us in this room aren't being fostered to meet our highest capacity within that paradigm. It is time for a new one. And so I would really, again, just champion that we look to the people who've been able to exist within their ecosystems in reciprocity and sustainability for millennia, and allow for indigenous people who care for 80% of the world's biodiversity to maybe be the ones who lead us towards a future where we can all thrive in our ecosystems.
Brilliant. Vern?
Energy is a global thing. The world needs a lot of energy for us to live. I'd love it if we lived in an unpoliticized conversation about energy. It's far too politicized both on the left and the right. It isn't a political thing. It's something that we all need, and if we could just tone the rhetoric down and have a real debate of how we solve these issues, that'd be great.
Arlene?
I think this question asks us to be in the space of, to answer as if the answer was a complicated answer. And I go to the difference between complication and complexity. It's very complicated to send a person to the moon, but it's complex to raise a child. And I think in this space, it's really complex as we address the challenges that we need to collectively address to reach net zero by 2050, and there are many others. That's just one. And so I think staying in this space, being willing to be in an uncomfortable space, roll up our sleeves, and do the serious work of, I think somebody else talked about work avoidance earlier today. I mean, we have to be willing to do the work. It's hard.
Absolutely. What a fantastic conversation. And before I thank my panel, I just want to thank each and every one of you, particularly for the honesty and the challenge of some of those questions. When I see things like that actually flash up, to me it's actually a reinforcement that we are building a phenomenal community who are holding our feet to the fire and challenging us to be better, but in a manner that is constructive and wanting to walk with us on that journey. It's exactly what each of these panelists has done, and I want to thank you for the way that you've engaged in the session too. Can you join me in giving an enormous thanks to Dr. Vivian Ming, Nikki Sanchez, Vern Yu, and Arlene Strom?